They called him Maximus the Merciful, though never to his face, and never where the guards could hear the whispered words that would have meant death for any slave foolish enough to speak them aloud. The sand of the Colosseum held secrets deeper than the blood it had drunk for generations, but none more dangerous than the truth about the gladiator who had learned to kill without killing, who had discovered ways to satisfy the crowd's hunger for death while preserving the lives Rome had marked for execution. The morning sun cast long shadows across the arena floor, where yesterday's battles had left their stains, and the air still carried the metallic taste of spilled blood mixed with the acrid smoke from torches that never fully died. Marcus Aurelius Maximus stood in the holding cell beneath the great amphitheater, his scarred hands wrapped around iron bars that had held countless warriors before their final walks into the light. His body bore the marks of 100 victories. The raised white lines where enemy blades had found their mark, the deeper grooves where wild beasts had tested his resolve, the careful scars he had carved into his own flesh to create the illusion of mortal wounds, when mortal wounds were what the audience demanded to see. But the deepest scars were invisible, carved into his soul by choices that no man should have to make, by nights spent in the darkness beneath Rome's greatest monument to glory, tending to wounds that officially did not exist because the people who bore them were supposed to be dead. Before we continue, subscribe to Sand, Blood and Chains, so the forgotten stories of the ancient world never die again. The iron gate creaked open with the sound that had become the rhythm of his existence, and Tribune Cassius stepped into the dim corridor with his usual expression of barely contained disgust. The tribune had never hidden his contempt for the gladiators under his command, but there was something different in his eyes when he looked at Maximus, a suspicion that had been growing sharper with each passing month, each battle that ended with unexpected mercy, each enemy who should have died but somehow found ways to survive. "You fight today against the Gaulish giant," Cassius announced, his voice echoing off stone walls that wept moisture from the weight of the structure above. "The crowd expects spectacle. They expect blood. They expect death." He stepped closer, close enough that Maximus could smell the wine on his breath and the perfumed oils in his hair. "They will not be disappointed." Maximus nodded with the stoic acceptance that was expected of him, but his mind was already working through the possibilities, the angles, the carefully calculated risks that might allow both him and his opponent to see another sunrise. The Gaulish fighter was new to the arena, but not to combat. Maximus had watched him train and seen the way he moved, with the fluid grace of a man who had learned to kill in forests and fields rather than for the entertainment of crowds. "There is talk," Cassius continued, his words dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his loudest shouts, "among the other fighters. Talk that suggests you are not the killer we purchased you to be. Talk that questions whether your victories are earned through skill or through—" He paused, letting the unspoken accusation hang in the air like incense from a funeral pyre. "Unconventional methods." The suggestion was treasonous and deadly, the implication that Maximus might be staging his fights, collaborating with his opponents to create false spectacle, while denying Rome the authentic violence it craved. Such accusations had led other gladiators to slow deaths in the arena's punishment cells, their bodies fed piece by piece to the wild animals that prowled the holding pens beneath the sand. "My record speaks for itself," Maximus replied, his voice carefully neutral. 73 victories, 73 opponents who challenged Rome's champion and found themselves wanting. 73 opponents, Cassius agreed. And yet how many of them truly died? How many were carried from the arena only to vanish from the death rolls, their bodies never found, their fates mysteriously uncertain? The Tribune's eyes glittered with malicious intelligence. It would be unfortunate if an investigation were required to resolve these inconsistencies. The threat was clear, and Maximus felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling across his shoulders like a cloak made of lead. Every life he had saved had increased the risk to his own survival. Every act of secret mercy had added another thread to the web of suspicion that was slowly closing around him. But the alternative, to become the killer Rome wanted him to be, was a surrender he could not contemplate without losing whatever remained of his humanity. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another gladiator, a massive Thracian, whose scarred face had earned him the arena name of Brutus the Bone Crusher. He moved with the heavy confidence of a man who had never learned to question the righteousness of violence, whose simple worldview divided all existence into categories of predator and prey. "The crowd is restless today," Brutus announced, settling his bulk against the stone wall with a sound like boulders grinding together. "They hunger for blood that flows freely and death that comes slowly. Yesterday's games were too merciful, too quick." The emperor himself was heard to complain that modern gladiators lack the proper spirit of their predecessors. Maximus absorbed this information without visible reaction, though his mind immediately began calculating the implications. Emperor Commodus was known for his erratic moods and his bloodthirsty appetites, and when the ruler of the known world expressed dissatisfaction with the quality of arena deaths, it typically meant that future games would feature increased brutality to compensate for perceived shortcomings. "Perhaps," Brutus continued, his small eyes fixed on Maximus with predatory interest, "it is time for certain fighters to remember that mercy is not among the virtues expected of champions. The crowd pays to see death, not theatrics." The accusation was more direct than Cassius's subtle threats, and Maximus understood that his reputation for unusual outcomes had spread beyond the administrative levels to include his fellow gladiators. In the brutal hierarchy of the arena, any perceived weakness was an invitation for challenge, and the suspicion that he was somehow avoiding the full measure of expected violence marked him as a target for those who sought to advance their own standing through demonstrations of superior ruthlessness. "Death comes to all fighters eventually," Maximus replied carefully. "The only question is whether it finds us in victory or defeat." "Indeed," agreed a new voice from the shadows, and Maximus felt his blood chill as he recognized the speaker. Gaius Flaminius emerged from the darkness beyond the holding cells, his presence unexpected and deeply unwelcome. As one of Rome's most celebrated former gladiators, now elevated to the position of lanista, Flaminius commanded respect and fear in equal measure. His reputation had been built on a legendary career that featured more confirmed kills than any fighter in arena history, and his transition to training and managing other gladiators had been marked by an uncompromising dedication to the principle that entertainment must be purchased with authentic suffering. "Maximus," Flaminius said, his voice carrying the deceptive gentleness of a snake preparing to strike. "Walk with me." The request was not optional, and Maximus found himself following the lanista through corridors he had hoped never to explore, deeper into the labyrinthine network of tunnels and chambers that existed beneath the arena floor. The air grew thicker as they descended, heavy with moisture and the accumulated stench of fear, blood, and death that had soaked into the very stones over decades of use. They passed doors that Maximus had learned not to examine too closely, rooms where the entertainment of Rome was prepared through methods that were never discussed in polite society. The sounds that leaked through those barriers, muffled screams, the rattle of chains, the wet slap of flesh being systematically destroyed, served as constant reminders of the price of failure in a world where human life was measured by its capacity to provide amusement for those with the power to demand such offerings. "You have a problem," Flaminius announced, when they reached a chamber that served as his private office, its walls decorated with weapons taken from fallen gladiators and preserved as trophies. Several problems, in fact, but one that threatens to overshadow all others. Maximus waited in silence, understanding that his role in this conversation was to listen rather than respond until specifically invited to speak. The lanista settled behind a desk carved from a single piece of black marble, its surface polished to mirror brightness and inscribed with names that represented the greatest champions in arena history. "There are whispers," Flaminius continued, "that suggest you have developed unconventional methods for achieving victory. Methods that preserve the lives of opponents who should properly die for the entertainment of Rome's citizens." He leaned forward, his weathered face catching the light from oil lamps that burned with the steady flame of eternal vigilance. Such whispers, if they were to reach the wrong ears, might result in investigations that would prove uncomfortable for everyone involved. The euphemism was delicate but clear, investigations that would involve torture, interrogation, and the systematic destruction of anyone suspected of betraying the fundamental principles upon which the arena system operated. Rome's entertainment was sacred, and any attempt to corrupt its authenticity was viewed as an attack on the empire itself. "I win my fights," Maximus said carefully. "The methods I employ have proven effective in satisfying both the crowd's expectations and the emperor's requirements." Effective, yes, but perhaps too effective in ways that were not intended. Flaminius stood and moved to a wall where weapons hung in careful display, his hands trailing across hilts and blades with the familiarity of long association. "Tell me, Maximus, what do you know about mercy?" The question seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, laden with implications that extended far beyond its simple words. Maximus felt the weight of countless secrets pressing against his chest, the accumulated burden of lives saved through deception, of deaths faked with such skill that even experienced observers had been convinced of their authenticity. "Mercy is weakness," he recited, offering the response that was expected from any gladiator worthy of the name. "It serves no purpose in the arena save to diminish the quality of entertainment provided to Rome's citizens." A correct answer, Flaminius agreed, though his tone suggested that correctness was not sufficient for his purposes. "And yet there are those who suggest that your understanding of mercy may be more nuanced than your words indicate, that you have found ways to interpret victory that do not always require the absolute death of your opponents." The accusation was becoming more specific, more dangerous, and Maximus understood that his carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble under sustained scrutiny. The network of helpers, bribes, and deceptions that had allowed him to save dozens of lives was built on secrecy and misdirection, and both were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as suspicion focused on his activities. "If there are concerns about my performance," he offered, "perhaps additional supervision during future contests would resolve any uncertainties about my methods." "Oh, there will be supervision," Flaminius assured him with a smile that held no warmth. "Beginning today, your battle against the Gaulish giant will be observed by officials whose only concern is ensuring that Roman justice is served with appropriate thoroughness. There will be no ambiguity about the outcome, no uncertainty about the fate of the defeated." Maximus felt something cold and sharp settle in his stomach as the full implications of this pronouncement became clear. Enhanced supervision meant that his usual techniques for preserving life while appearing to take it would be impossible to employ. The careful choreography of staged violence, The precisely calculated wounds that appeared fatal but avoided vital organs, the collaboration with opponents who understood that survival required the appearance of death. None of these methods would survive close observation by officials trained to detect deception. If you're still here, subscribe. You're the kind of person who keeps forgotten history alive. The remainder of the conversation passed in a blur of warnings and threats, disguised as professional advice. But Maximus found his attention increasingly focused on the challenge that awaited him in the arena above. For the first time since he had discovered his capacity for preserving life within the context of sanctioned killing, he faced the possibility that his choice might be reduced to its most basic terms: kill or be revealed as a fraud whose punishment would extend far beyond his own destruction. The holding area beneath the arena floor buzzed with the usual pre-combat activities. Gladiators checking equipment, trainers offering final advice, slaves applying oils and ointments to muscles that would soon be tested to their limits. But there was an undercurrent of tension that went beyond normal pre-battle nerves, a sense that something significant was about to unfold that would affect more than just the immediate participants. Maximus found the Gaulish giant in a corner of the preparation area, a mountain of scarred muscle whose presence seemed to dwarf even the substantial stone architecture that surrounded them. The man's name was Brennus, and his reputation had preceded his arrival in Rome, a warrior who had led his tribe's resistance against Roman expansion until betrayal and overwhelming odds had resulted in his capture and subsequent sale to the arena system. "So you are the famous Maximus," Brennus said in accented Latin, his voice carrying the deep resonance of a man accustomed to being heard across battlefields. "The gladiator who wins without killing, who shows mercy where mercy is forbidden." The words were spoken quietly, but in the crowded preparation area, they might as well have been shouted from the arena floor. Several nearby fighters paused in their activities, ears straining to catch additional details of a conversation that touched on subjects that were simultaneously fascinating and dangerous to discuss. "I know nothing of mercy," Maximus replied, his voice pitched to carry to those who were obviously listening. "I know only victory and the methods required to achieve it consistently." "Ah, but methods can be varied, can they not?" Brennus leaned closer, his massive frame creating a barrier that partially concealed their conversation from casual observation. "I have heard interesting stories about your methods. Stories that suggest a man of conscience operating within a system that prohibits conscience from existing." Maximus felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling across his shoulders as he realized that his reputation had reached even the newest arrivals to Rome's gladiatorial system. The network of whispers and rumors that he had hoped to contain was spreading beyond his ability to control, creating dangers that multiplied with each person who suspected the truth about his activities. "Today we fight," he said simply. "The rest is speculation that serves no useful purpose." "Today we fight," Brennus agreed, "but the question remains, do we fight to kill or do we fight to satisfy the crowd while preserving what can be preserved?" The giant's eyes held intelligence that belied his primitive appearance, and Maximus recognized in them the calculating awareness of a man who had spent years navigating the complexities of survival in hostile circumstances. Before Maximus could respond, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of arena officials bearing the equipment that would be used in the day's contest. The weapons were examined and approved according to established protocols, each blade tested for sharpness and balance to ensure that the combat would provide the level of spectacle that Roman audiences demanded. But there was something different about the supervision today, an intensity of observation that went beyond routine inspection. Tribune Cassius was present, along with several other officials whose presence indicated that this particular contest was being treated as more than routine entertainment. Maximus understood that he was being tested, that his performance today would determine whether the growing suspicions about his methods would be confirmed or dismissed. The call came with the brazen voice of horns that echoed through the underground chambers like the trumpet of judgment, and Maximus found himself walking the familiar path toward the light that marked the entrance to the arena floor. Each step carried the weight of accumulated choices, of lives saved through deception, of deaths faked with such skill that even the most experienced observers had been convinced of their authenticity. The sand beneath his feet was fresh, but already marked with dark stains from the morning's earlier contests, and the roar of the crowd washed over him like the sound of an ocean storm breaking against unforgiving cliffs. 60,000 voices raised in anticipation of death, 60,000 pairs of eyes focused on the spectacle that was about to unfold, 60,000 witnesses to whatever choice he would make in the next few minutes. Brennus entered from the opposite side of the arena, his massive frame drawing appreciative roars from spectators who recognized the promise of exceptional violence in his imposing presence. The Gaul moved with surprising grace for a man of his size, his weapons held with the casual familiarity of long practice, his eyes scanning the arena with the tactical awareness of someone who had learned to survive by understanding every aspect of his environment. The formal announcements were made with the pompous ceremony that Roman audiences expected, each gladiator's history and achievements recited in words designed to heighten anticipation for the blood that was to come. Maximus listened to his own introduction with the detachment of someone hearing his life summarized by a stranger, noting the emphasis placed on his reputation for delivering spectacular deaths to worthy opponents. When the horn sounded to begin combat, Maximus moved with the fluid economy of motion that had kept him alive through 73 previous contests. His sword felt natural in his hand, an extension of his will that had been shaped by years of practice into an instrument capable of precise and devastating effect. But today, that precision would be tested not by his ability to kill, but by his capacity to preserve life while maintaining the appearance of lethal intent. The early exchanges established the rhythm of their combat, each warrior probing for weaknesses while avoiding the kind of committed attacks that might end the contest too quickly. The crowd demanded entertainment value as much as they craved death, and experienced gladiators understood that a battle which ended within the first few moments left audiences feeling cheated of the spectacle they had paid to witness. But Maximus could sense the intensity of observation focused on their every movement, could feel the weight of official scrutiny that was analyzing each blow for evidence of the deception he was accused of employing. Every technique he had developed for creating the appearance of mortal wounds while avoiding actual fatality was now subject to examination by experts trained to detect such subterfuge. As the combat progressed, he found himself forced to employ increasingly dangerous tactics, coming closer to actually inflicting serious harm as he struggled to maintain the authenticity that would satisfy his watchers. Brennus seemed to understand the constraints under which they both operated, adjusting his own performance to create opportunities for spectacular near misses, while avoiding the kind of decisive openings that would force either fighter into genuinely lethal action. The crisis came when a particularly ambitious attack brought Maximus inside his opponent's guard, his blade positioned for a thrust that should have ended the contest with the kind of definitive brutality that Roman audiences craved. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, he found himself facing the choice that had haunted his dreams since the day he first discovered his inability to kill without cause. Time slowed to the pace of honey flowing from a broken jar as he studied Brennus's face, seeing there not an enemy to be destroyed, but a man whose survival depended on Maximus's willingness to preserve the deception that had protected so many others. The roar of the crowd faded to a distant whisper as he calculated angles and possibilities, searching for some way to satisfy the demands of spectacle while avoiding the finality of murder. The solution came to him with the clarity of divine inspiration, a technique so subtle and complex that even trained observers might miss its true nature in the heat of apparent violence. He shifted his grip slightly, angling the blade to create the appearance of a killing thrust, while actually directing it toward a location that would produce spectacular bleeding without touching any organ vital to his opponent's survival. The execution required perfect timing and absolute precision, but as his sword found its mark, Maximus felt the familiar satisfaction of a deception successfully completed. Brennus's reaction was flawless, his body convulsing with apparent mortal agony as carefully applied pressure to specific points created the illusion of life departing from his massive frame. The crowd erupted with the primal satisfaction of witnessing authentic death delivered with appropriate skill and brutality. 60,000 voices raised in approval of a spectacle that had met their expectations for violence, while providing the kind of dramatic conclusion that would be discussed and remembered long after the blood had been raked from the arena sand. But as Maximus stood over his apparently defeated opponent, he became aware of a subtle change in the quality of observation focused upon him. Tribune Cassius had moved closer to the arena floor, his position allowing him to study the details of Brennus's condition with uncomfortable intensity. Other officials had similarly adjusted their positions, their collective attention creating a weight of scrutiny that pressed against Maximus like the heat from a forge fire. He understood that the deception which had satisfied the crowd was being subjected to more sophisticated analysis by observers trained to detect the exact techniques he had employed. The carefully controlled bleeding, the precise placement of wounds designed to appear fatal while avoiding actual lethality. The performance of death that was convincing to casual observation, but might not withstand expert examination. All of these elements were being evaluated by men whose professional survival depended on their ability to distinguish between authentic and manufactured violence. The traditional conclusion to such contests required the victor to confirm the death of his opponent, typically through a final thrust that removed any possibility of survival. It was a ritual that served both practical and ceremonial purposes, ensuring that defeated gladiators could not recover to fight again, while providing audiences with the definitive conclusion they expected from arena combat. As Maximus raised his sword for this final stroke, he caught a glimpse of movement from the viewing platform where Tribune Cassius and his fellow observers maintained their watch. The subtle gesture that passed between officials confirmed his worst fears. They had detected something irregular about the contest, something that required additional verification beyond the normal protocols. The moment of choice stretched before him like a chasm that could be crossed only through absolute commitment to one path or another. He could complete the ritual killing and preserve his secret at the cost of a life he had spent considerable risk to save, or he could refuse and face the consequences of open defiance against the system that had made him what he was. Subscribe to Sand, Blood and Chains, for more forbidden stories history tried to bury. The decision was made not through conscious thought, but through the accumulated weight of choices that had defined his character over years of secret rebellion against the role Rome had forced him to play. As his sword descended toward Brennus's apparently lifeless form, Maximus made a minute adjustment that directed the blade harmlessly into the sand beside his opponent's head, the action concealed from crowd observation by the angle of his body. But the movement was visible to the officials, whose elevated position allowed them to observe details hidden from general view. And Maximus saw in their faces the confirmation of suspicions that had been building for months. The deception had been detected. The carefully maintained facade had finally crumbled under scrutiny that was too intense and too knowledgeable to be fooled by even his most sophisticated techniques. The aftermath unfolded with the inevitable progression of a landslide that begins with a single displaced stone and concludes with the destruction of everything below. Tribune Cassius descended to the arena floor with the grim satisfaction of a hunter who has finally cornered his quarry, his escort of guards positioning themselves to prevent any possibility of escape or resistance. "An interesting performance," Cassius announced, his voice carrying clearly across the sand, despite the continued roar of a crowd that remained unaware of the drama unfolding before them, though perhaps not quite the performance that was advertised. Maximus stood motionless above Brennus's still form, understanding that any attempt at explanation or justification would only confirm what had already been observed. The web of secrecy that had protected his activities for so long had finally been torn beyond repair, exposing not only his own deception, but potentially threatening every life he had worked to preserve. "The Gladiator lives," Cassius continued, gesturing toward Brennus with casual contempt. "Against all appearance, against all expectation, he lives because you have chosen to show mercy where mercy is forbidden, to preserve life where life was forfeit to Rome's entertainment." The accusation hung in the air like incense from a funeral pyre, its implications extending far beyond the immediate participants to encompass everyone who had been touched by Maximus's secret campaign of preservation. Names and faces flashed through his memory. Women who should have been executed, but who lived hidden in safe houses throughout the city. Children who had been marked for death, but who played in secret gardens, tended by those who understood the value of innocent life. Men whose crimes against Rome had been forgiven through carefully staged deaths that allowed them to disappear into new identities. "You will explain," Cassius commanded, "how you have accomplished these deceptions. You will provide the names of those who have assisted you, the locations where supposed corpses have been concealed, the methods by which Roman justice has been subverted through your treasonous compassion." The demand was reasonable from the perspective of Roman law, which recognized no distinction between mercy and treason when applied to those who had been condemned by imperial authority. But compliance would mean the destruction of everything Maximus had worked to build, the exposure of a network that existed only through secrecy and trust. "I have won 73 victories," he replied, his voice carrying across the arena with the calm certainty of a man who has finally reached the moment for which all previous moments were merely preparation. 73 opponents who challenged Rome's champion and found themselves defeated. The methods by which victory was achieved are mine alone. Methods that included deception, fraud, and conspiracy against the imperial system of justice, Cassius countered, his anger beginning to show through the veneer of official propriety. Methods that constitute treason against Rome itself. The crowd was beginning to sense that something unusual was occurring on the arena floor, their celebratory roar gradually diminishing as they focused attention on the confrontation between Gladiator and Tribune. Conversations rippled through the stands as spectators tried to understand why the traditional conclusion to combat had been interrupted by what appeared to be an official investigation. Maximus found himself thinking about the child he had saved 3 months earlier, a girl whose only crime had been witnessing a conversation that certain powerful men preferred to keep secret. She had been scheduled for execution disguised as a wild animal attack, a spectacle that would have satisfied the crowd's appetite for violence while eliminating an inconvenient witness to political corruption. Instead, she now lived in a house beyond the city walls, learning to read and write under the care of a woman whose own supposed death had been accomplished through similar deception. The child sang songs in the evening that reminded everyone around her that beauty could exist even in a world that seemed dedicated to its destruction. He thought about the physician who had helped him perfect techniques for creating convincing wounds without causing permanent harm, whose knowledge of anatomy had been essential to the success of their shared deceptions. The man had risked his own life repeatedly, understanding that discovery would mean not just personal destruction, but the elimination of anyone connected to their activities. He thought about the networks of safe houses, the carefully constructed identities, the bribes and favors and accumulated debts that had made it possible for condemned prisoners to vanish into new lives rather than feed the appetite of crowds that confused suffering with entertainment. All of it hung in the balance now, dependent on choices made by a man who had discovered that some principles were worth dying to defend. "The crowd grows restless," he observed, noting the way conversations were spreading through the stands as spectators struggled to understand why their entertainment had been interrupted. They came to see death delivered with appropriate skill. Perhaps it would be better to give them what they expect. Cassius smiled with the predatory satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally cornered his prey beyond any possibility of escape. "Oh, they will see death today, multiple deaths in fact, as we explore the full extent of your network of treason and the fate of those who have aided your crimes against Rome." The threat was clear and comprehensive, encompassing not just Maximus but everyone who had participated in or benefited from his campaign of secret preservation. It was the kind of systematic destruction that Roman authority employed when examples needed to be set, when the cost of mercy needed to be demonstrated with sufficient brutality to discourage future acts of similar compassion. But threats, like promises, derived their power from the ability of those who made them to control the circumstances under which they would be fulfilled. And Maximus had spent years learning to recognize the moments when control shifted, when the apparently powerless discovered that they possessed options that their oppressors had failed to anticipate. The arena was designed to contain violence within carefully controlled parameters, to allow spectacle, while preventing chaos from spreading beyond the boundaries established by Roman engineering and Roman authority. But those same boundaries that limited the movement of gladiators also constrained the options available to officials who found themselves confronted by someone willing to reject the fundamental assumptions upon which the entire system operated. With movements too fast for guards to intercept, Maximus retrieved his sword from where it had been driven into the sand beside Brennus's motionless form. The blade came free with a whisper of steel against earth, its weight familiar and reassuring in hands that had learned to use it as an instrument of preservation rather than destruction. "Stand down," Cassius commanded, though the uncertainty in his voice suggested that he was beginning to understand that the situation was evolving beyond his ability to control through traditional authority. "You are surrounded, outnumbered, and facing charges that carry only one possible sentence." "Then let the sentence be carried out," Maximus replied, settling into the combat stance that had become as natural to him as breathing. "But let it be carried out according to the customs of the arena, where skill determines survival and courage earns the right to die with honor intact." The challenge was audacious, unprecedented, and completely within the legal framework that governed gladiatorial combat. A condemned prisoner had the right to trial by combat, and a gladiator facing charges of treason could invoke the same privilege that was extended to any Roman citizen accused of capital crimes. More importantly, the challenge was being issued in front of 60,000 witnesses whose expectations of entertainment had been frustrated by the interruption of what they had assumed would be a straightforward conclusion to the day's combat. Refusing to accept the gladiator's demand for trial by combat would require explanations that might expose aspects of arena operations that were better kept hidden from public scrutiny. Cassius found himself trapped between competing pressures the need to maintain his authority over the gladiatorial system, and the equally important requirement to avoid creating public disturbances that might attract unwanted attention from higher levels of imperial administration. A riot in the Colosseum would reflect poorly on everyone responsible for maintaining order, and riots had been started by less provocation than the denial of traditional rights to popular champions. "Very well," he conceded, though his tone carried promises of consequences that would extend far beyond the immediate combat. "Trial by combat, according to ancient custom, but understand that your victory, should you somehow achieve it, will only delay the inevitable investigation into your activities." The concession was grudging but sufficient to satisfy the legal requirements, and Maximus felt a surge of grim satisfaction as he realized that his gamble had succeeded in buying time and opportunity where none had existed before. The trial would be conducted according to rules that he understood intimately, in an environment where his skills provided him with advantages that could not be countered through simple numerical superiority. But the identity of his opponent remained to be determined, and that choice would ultimately determine whether trial by combat offered genuine opportunity for survival or merely a more dramatic form of execution. The answer came with a flourish of ceremonial horns that announced the entrance of a figure whose appearance drew gasps of recognition from the crowd. Gaius Flaminius emerged from the shadows beneath the arena floor, no longer dressed in the administrative robes of a lanista, but wearing the leather and bronze armor of an active gladiator. The sight of the legendary champion returning to active combat after years of administrative duties sent waves of excitement through the stands that had nothing to do with the political implications of what was occurring. This was spectacle of the highest order. Two masters of arena combat facing each other with stakes that transcended mere entertainment. But for Maximus, the appearance of his opponent represented something far more complex than a simple test of martial skill. Flaminius was not just the most accomplished killer in arena history, he was also the architect of the system that had made such killing into an art form refined for maximum efficiency and maximum impact on spectators. More troubling still, Flaminius knew every technique Maximus had developed for preserving life while appearing to take it, every subtle deception that had allowed mercy to masquerade as murder. The lanista had overseen the training that created those capabilities, had observed their development through years of careful practice, had quite possibly suspected their true purpose long before other officials began to notice irregularities. "You understand," Flaminius said as they circled each other in the ritual preliminary to combat, "that there can be no deception here, no staged wounds, no carefully calculated near misses, no performance of death that preserves the performer. Today, one of us dies truly and finally." The words carried the weight of absolute certainty, spoken by a man who had killed too many opponents to harbor any illusions about the nature of lethal combat. But they also carried an undertone of something that might have been respect, recognition of skills that had been employed for purposes other than those for which they were originally intended. "I understand," Maximus replied, and realized as he spoke that he was finally free from the constraints that had defined his existence for so long. No longer was he required to kill while appearing to show mercy. No longer was he forced to preserve life while satisfying expectations of death. Today, he could fight with the full measure of his abilities, unconstrained by the need to maintain deceptions that had become increasingly difficult to sustain. The combat that followed was unlike anything the arena had witnessed in decades. Two masters of their craft engaged in a contest that transcended mere violence to become something approaching art, each movement calculated and precise, Each attack and defense executed with the kind of perfection that comes only from years of dedicated practice under the most demanding conditions. But beneath the spectacular display of martial skill was a deeper struggle between competing philosophies of what it meant to be human, in a world that often seemed designed to strip away humanity from those it claimed to serve. Flaminius fought with the ruthless efficiency of a man who had accepted Rome's definition of strength and found meaning through absolute adherence to its principles. Maximus fought with the desperate intensity of someone who had discovered that true strength sometimes required the courage to reject definitions imposed by others, even when that rejection carried the promise of destruction. The end came not with the dramatic flourish that crowds expected from arena combat, but with the kind of subtle precision that marked the difference between competent gladiators and true masters of their craft. A slight miscalculation in timing, a fractional error in distance estimation, a moment of hesitation that created an opening too perfect to ignore. When Flaminius fell, it was with the surprise of a man who had believed himself beyond the reach of defeat, who had spent so many years as the instrument of other people's deaths that he had forgotten his own mortality. But there was also something that might have been relief in his eyes, as if some part of him welcomed the end of a burden he had carried for too long. "You win," he whispered with the last breath that would carry his voice, "but victory may not bring you what you expect to find." Maximus knelt beside his fallen opponent, understanding that the death of Gaius Flaminius marked the end of more than just a single life. The lanista had been the living embodiment of Rome's gladiatorial system, its most successful product and its most devoted servant. His defeat suggested that even the empire's most cherished institutions might not be as invulnerable as they appeared. The crowd erupted with enthusiasm that had nothing to do with political implications and everything to do with witnessing combat that would be discussed and remembered for generations. They had seen a legend fall and a new legend born, had been present at the kind of moment that transforms entertainment into history. But for Maximus, standing alone in the center of the arena with the blood of a worthy opponent on his sword, victory felt less like triumph than like the beginning of an even more challenging phase of existence. He had won the right to continue living, but he had also ensured that his activities would now be subjected to the kind of scrutiny that would make future deceptions impossible to maintain. In the days that followed, as investigations into his network of preserved lives proceeded with systematic thoroughness, Maximus discovered that his victory had accomplished something he had not anticipated. The spectacular nature of his trial by combat had created a legend that proved more durable than the political forces arrayed against him, and legends, once established, became difficult for even imperial authority to simply erase. The emperor himself intervened in the case, declaring that a gladiator capable of defeating the legendary Flaminius in single combat deserved clemency regardless of any irregularities in his previous activities. The ruling was politically motivated. Commodus understood that popular champions were valuable assets that should not be discarded lightly, but it provided protection that extended beyond Maximus to encompass those who had aided his campaign of secret mercy. In the end, he was not the gladiator Rome created, but the man he chose to become when given the opportunity to define himself through actions rather than through roles imposed by others who had never asked what he wanted his life to mean.